The morning I saw my cornfield withering away, I instantly knew who was behind it. The lingering stench of chemicals still hung in the air, and the once vibrant stalks were now curled up and turning brown, as though some dark spell had been cast overnight. I stood there, staring at the damage, anger rising inside me. My land, my livelihood, my family's farm, under attack, not by some random disaster or force of nature, but by a deliberate act. This wasn't just bad luck. It was war, and there was only one person petty, spiteful, and foolish enough to think she could get away with it: Karen. I should have seen it coming. The moment she took over as HOA president, she started treating my cornfield like it was an offense to the suburban ideal. My farm had been here long before the HOA. It wasn't just land, it was part of my legacy. My grandfather built this farm from scratch, and I wasn't going to let some overly perfumed, clipboard-holding dictator tell me what I could and couldn't grow. Karen didn't care about history or tradition. All she cared about was property values and her obsessive need to control everything within a 5-mile radius of her big, fancy house. It started with the letters. At first, they were vaguely polite, written in that passive-aggressive tone that every HOA uses. Dear homeowner, we've noticed that your property doesn't quite fit in with the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. That kind of garbage. I ignored them. Then came the fines. She tried to claim my cornfield was some unapproved structure. I laughed it off, called her out, and reminded her that my land wasn't even under the HOA's control. But Karen wasn't one to accept reality. She escalated. I caught her standing on the edge of my property more than once, arms crossed, lips pursed in disapproval. She made it clear in every conversation that she hated my farm, hated my crops, and most of all, hated that I didn't bow to her authority like the rest of the neighborhood. This is supposed to be a respectable community. She once huffed at me, tapping away on her phone, probably writing another bogus complaint. People don't want to see this. She pointed to my cornfield like it was a junkyard. I grinned. Well, then maybe they shouldn't have built their cookie-cutter homes next to a working farm. Her nostrils flared. She stormed off, muttering about me being an uncooperative troublemaker. I thought that would be the end of it. I figured she'd eventually lose interest and find someone else to pick on. I didn't realize just how far her HOA obsession would go. The night before I found my field ruined, I heard something strange outside. It sounded mechanical, like a faint hiss, almost like an aerosol can being sprayed on a huge scale. I should have checked. I should have investigated. But I was exhausted from a long day working the land, and I figured it was just the wind messing with me. The next morning, reality hit me hard. My cornfield was dying. Whole sections of it had been poisoned. I ran my hands over the wilting stalks, rage surging through me. This wasn't some accident. It was deliberate. Someone had sprayed herbicide across my entire field, and I knew exactly who. I stormed inside, pulled up the footage from my security cameras, and there she was. Karen, walking onto my land in the dead of night, carrying a damn industrial sprayer. She strutted through the rows like she was some sort of crusader, soaking my crops with the precision of someone who had spent too much time micromanaging lawns. When she was finished, she stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed, admiring the damage like she had just created a masterpiece. I stared at the screen, my fists so tight my knuckles turned white. Karen thought she was untouchable. She thought she could do whatever she wanted just because she had a laminated badge that said HOA president. She had no idea what she'd just done. I wasn't the kind of guy who let things slide. I played by the rules, sure, but I knew how to use them. And Karen had just crossed a serious line. She didn't just ruin my crops. She committed agricultural vandalism, a felony in this state. The fines alone could bankrupt her, and if I played my cards right, she might even face jail time. I called up my buddy Mark, who worked as an agricultural inspector. When he saw my field, he whistled low. This isn't just vandalism, Jake. This is a damn felony. She's looking at some serious consequences, he added. Good. That was exactly what I wanted. But I wasn't done. I wanted Karen to feel every bit of what she'd done. I wanted her to squirm. So I made some calls. First, I reported the crime to the cops, sending them the footage as evidence. Then, I reached out to a few local news stations, letting them know that a certain HOA president had been caught destroying a farmer's crops. Within hours, the story started to spread. Local HOA president caught poisoning crops, one headline read. Suburban tyrant targets family farm in bizarre power move, said another. The HOA members, who had once cowered under Karen's control, started to panic. They didn't care about my farm, but they sure as hell cared about their property values. And nothing tanks real estate prices faster than a neighborhood scandal. Karen had no clue what was coming. She thought she had won. That was the funniest part. The day after I reported her, she walked around the neighborhood like she had just conquered a kingdom. She even had the audacity to send me another HOA violation letter, this one claiming my now-dead cornfield was an unsightly nuisance and needed to be removed immediately. I couldn't help but grin. Oh, Karen, you have no idea. That night, I kicked back with a cold beer, watching the storm I'd set in motion start to unfold. The cops were investigating. The news was all over it. The HOA board was beginning to turn on her. And Karen? She was blissfully unaware that the empire she'd built on intimidation and bureaucracy was about to come crashing down. She thought she had won. She thought she could spray my field, kill my crops, and walk away without facing any consequences. She had no clue that by morning, she'd be the one watching everything she'd built fall apart. The next day, I woke up to a message from my buddy Mark. Lab results are in. Definitely herbicide. You were right. I didn't need the confirmation, but seeing it in writing made my blood boil all over again. This wasn't just a random act of sabotage. This was premeditated crop destruction, and in our state, that came with serious penalties. I wasn't dealing with just an annoying HOA president anymore. I was dealing with a full-blown criminal. I called Mark back. How bad is it? Real bad, he said. The chemicals have gone deep into the soil. Even if you replant tomorrow, that land's dead for the season. I gritted my teeth. That meant lost income, lost time, and a hell of a lot of unnecessary work to fix the damage. Karen had wiped out months of hard work with just a few passes of a sprayer. And for what? Because she didn't like the sight of corn? Because she thought she could bully me into submission like she did everyone else in the neighborhood? I thanked Mark and hung up. I had everything I needed, and I wasn't about to let Karen get away with this. I grabbed the security footage, the lab results, and a statement about the damages, then drove straight to the police station. The officer at the front desk barely looked up when I walked in. "What can I do for you?" he asked, sounding like he couldn't care less. I dropped the folder on the counter. "I want to file charges." That got his attention. He opened the file, flipping through the photos of my ruined field, the chemical analysis, and the screenshots from my security footage. His eyebrows shot up. "You're saying someone did this on purpose?" "I'm saying I have video proof of a woman breaking onto my property and spraying my crops with industrial-strength herbicide," I told him. "And I want her held accountable." The officer took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, let's get a report started." By the time I left the station, Karen's fate was officially out of my hands. The cops had everything they needed to start an investigation, and knowing how much she loved control, I couldn't wait to see her reaction when she realized she had none. I didn't have to wait long. That afternoon, 2 patrol cars pulled up to Karen's house. A couple of officers knocked on her door while a third stood back, watching everything go down. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw the exact moment she realized she was in trouble. Her arms flailed around as she tried to argue, her voice rising high enough for me to catch bits of her shrieking protests. She pointed at my farm, then at the officers, then back at my farm, as if that somehow explained what she'd done. Then they handed her a piece of paper, and her face turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. A notice of investigation. Karen was officially under investigation for property destruction and agricultural vandalism, both of which carried serious fines. I could almost hear the wheels turning in her head as she scrambled to figure out how to get out of this. But she wasn't getting out of it. Not this time. The word spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. The HOA members who had once been terrified of Karen's authority began talking behind her back. I found out that at least 3 people had already started discussing removing her from office. People who had once been afraid of her suddenly realized she wasn't as untouchable as she made herself out to be. That evening, I received an email from the HOA board. Apparently, Karen had tried to convince them that I had faked the entire thing, that I had poisoned my own crops just to make her look bad. They didn't buy it. The next morning, I decided to turn up the heat even more. I contacted a local news station, giving them a tip about an HOA president facing legal trouble for destroying a farmer's crops. Reporters loved a good HOA scandal, and within hours, the story was live. I figured Karen would completely lose it over it. What I didn't expect was for her to double down on her craziness. 2 days later, I came home to find another HOA violation letter stuffed into my mailbox. This one, written in Karen's trademark passive-aggressive style, informed me that my now-dead cornfield was an eyesore and needed to be removed immediately. I laughed so hard I almost choked. She was under police investigation, her reputation was in shambles, and yet her first move was trying to find me for damages she caused. The woman had completely lost it. That night, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Karen showed up looking like she'd been through a hurricane, her hair all over the place, and the smug look she usually wore was replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. I sat in the back, watching as the board members, one by one, began to turn on her. "We've received multiple complaints about abuse of power," one board member said. "There's a police investigation," another added. "We can't have that kind of liability tied to our HOA." Karen sputtered, shaking her head furiously. "This is ridiculous. You're all being manipulated by him. He's a troublemaker, always has been. This is all just some elaborate revenge plot." "Do you have any proof of that?" someone interrupted. She froze. Silence. For the first time since she had taken over the HOA, she was completely out of excuses. The vote to remove her from her position wasn't even close. One by one, the board members raised their hands to strip her of her title. Even the people who had supported her in the past seemed to realize that backing her wasn't worth the trouble. Karen stood there, stunned, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Then she turned and locked eyes with me. "This isn't over," she hissed. I smiled. "Oh, it really is." The moment she stormed out of the meeting, I knew I had won. But I wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. Karen wasn't the type to just walk away quietly. The day after she was officially removed as HOA president, she made it her mission to make my life miserable. I woke up to find my mailbox knocked over, the wooden post completely snapped in half. That same afternoon, my truck mysteriously got a flat tire while parked in my own driveway. I had no proof it was her, but I didn't need any. The pure pettiness of it screamed Karen. It was the kind of move she would make just to reassure herself that she still had some control left. But she didn't. That was the part she hadn't figured out yet. The police investigation wasn't just continuing, it was gaining momentum. Karen probably thought everything would blow over with a slap on the wrist, maybe a small fine, or a warning at worst. She completely underestimated how serious agricultural vandalism was in our state. Destroying crops wasn't like breaking a fence or throwing trash on someone's lawn. It was an attack on someone's livelihood, and the law didn't take that lightly. She wasn't just facing fines. She was facing enormous fines, the kind that could wipe out someone's savings in a heartbeat. I made sure to remind her of that. The next time I saw her, she was trying to intimidate one of the HOA board members in their driveway, her arms flailing as she ranted about some neighborhood conspiracy against her. I leaned against my truck and called out to her. "You hear back from the county yet?" I asked casually. "They gave me an update this morning." Karen stiffened, slowly turning toward me. "I have no idea what you're talking about." I smirked. "Oh, you will soon enough." She stormed off without another word, but I could see the way her face went pale, the way her hands balled into fists as she walked away. She was scared, and for the first time, she had every right to be. The real fun started when the HOA officially announced her removal to the rest of the neighborhood. Not a single person seemed upset about it. People had been dealing with her nonsense for years, too afraid to fight back, too worried about being fined into oblivion. But once she was gone, the story started coming out. One neighbor admitted that Karen had fined them $300 for having a basketball hoop in their driveway, even though it wasn't against any official rule. Another revealed that she had threatened to have their car towed because it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. There were stories about her spying on people from her windows, measuring grass height with a ruler, and even harassing the mail carrier for delivering packages too loudly. The neighborhood had been living under a dictatorship, and no one realized how bad it was until the tyrant was finally dethroned. That might have been enough for some people. That might have been the moment where I walked away, satisfied that I had won. But I wasn't done yet. A few days later, Karen got the official notice of her fines. The amount was brutal. Between the agricultural vandalism charges, the damages, and the mounting legal fees, she was staring down nearly $30,000 in penalties. I knew the moment she opened the letter because I heard her scream from across the street. It was the kind of sound that could peel paint off the wall a mix of rage and disbelief. I sat on my porch, sipping my coffee, watching as she stomped around her yard in fury. She grabbed her phone and started making calls, probably trying to find some loophole, some way to wriggle out of the mess she'd made. But there was no way out. She had done this to herself, and now she had to face the consequences. In the weeks that followed, things just kept getting worse for her. With no job, no HOA position to cling to, and a financial nightmare hanging over her head, Karen started to spiral. The people who once feared her now openly mocked her. The same neighbors she had tormented for years now refused to even acknowledge her when she walked by. She had become a joke, and she knew it. Then, the final blow landed. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Karen was selling her house. She couldn't afford to stay. Between the fines, legal fees, and the HOA turning their back on her, she had no other option. She listed it for an absurd price, hoping to salvage something from her downfall. But no one in the neighborhood wanted to live in the former HOA dictator's house. The property sat on the market, its price dropping lower and lower. Then I had an idea. I called my lawyer, made a few arrangements, and placed an offer. It was insultingly low, the kind of offer that would usually get laughed off. But Karen didn't have the luxury of turning it down. She had no buyers, no other options. She had to take it. The day the sale was finalized, I made sure to be standing on my porch, waiting for her as she loaded the last of her things into a U-Haul. She saw me, glared, and for a second, I thought she might try to say something. But she didn't. She just shook her head, climbed into her car, and drove away. I took a deep breath, looking at my newly acquired property. It wasn't just about the house. It was about the message it sent. Karen had spent years trying to control everything and everyone around her, believing she was above the rules, above consequences. And now she was gone. But I wasn't just going to let the house sit there as a trophy. No, I had bigger plans. A few weeks later, the grand opening of Karen's Crops was announced to the neighborhood. The once pristine, over-manicured front yard of Karen's former home was now a thriving little farm stand, filled with fresh produce grown from my land. People loved it. They loved the irony. The fact that the very thing Karen had tried to destroy was now flourishing in the place she once called home. The HOA, under new leadership, actually embraced the idea. They even helped promote it, eager to distance themselves from Karen's reign of terror. And just like that, the neighborhood was a better place. The absurd fines stopped. The constant surveillance ended. People could actually enjoy their homes without the looming threat of a clipboard-wielding maniac breathing down their necks. As for Karen, nobody really knew where she ended up. There were rumors that she moved to a town a few states over, that she tried to worm her way into another HOA position but was blacklisted as soon as her past was uncovered. Some said she was still fighting her fines in court, but that she was losing badly. I didn't care. She was out of my life, out of my town, and that was all that mattered. One evening, as I locked up the farm stand and looked out over my newly replanted cornfield, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. Karen had tried to control everything. She had tried to destroy my crops, my business, my way of life. But in the end, all she had done was ruin herself. And as I walked back to my house, the sun setting behind me, I couldn't help but smile. Because for the first time in years, the neighborhood finally felt like home again.